If you've been involved in grappling or martial arts, you've probably heard that kettlebells are a great tool for strength and conditioning. But there's also a lot of confusion and bad info out there. Some people say that they're overhyped. Some people say that they cause injuries, which they definitely can. Some people say that they're only for cardio, etc. In this video, I'm going to cut through all the bullshit. I'm going to give you a very simple, straightforward guide to how you can start using kettlebells to make yourself a better grappler, get stronger, more powerful, and more resistant to injury. Hi, my name is Jason Kapnick. I'm a jiu-jitsu black belt. I have over 20 years experience in strength and conditioning, and I train grapplers on how to be stronger, more durable, and harder to break. In this video, I'm going to give you an overview of how you can use kettlebells to make the most of your strength and conditioning training. So first of all, what's so great about kettlebells? Well, kind of twofold. I would say that in terms of the weight being offset from the handle, it allows you to do some really dynamic ballistic movements like kettlebell swings, which lead into kettlebell snatches and cleans. And these ballistic movements, they train power, they can train power endurance, and they also have a relationship between tension and relaxation that can be really beneficial as opposed to traditional weightlifting where it's all tense all the time. The kettlebell can promote some looseness and crispness to your movement that really carries over well to grappling. The other good thing about a kettlebell is the way the kettlebell sits on your hand allows you to do more natural human movements that can be more complicated. And it's also a really good implement for pressing. So pressing and really anything with my arm extended overhead, the weight sits behind my hand, which it's a very predictable way that it sits. It's a little bit, I think it's more stable. When you're first getting used to it, it probably feels a lot more unstable. But the way that the weight sits, it promotes really good shoulder mechanics, and it's a very just convenient and strong way to lift a lot of weight overhead. So one of the common pitfalls I hear that when people get started with kettlebells is that they get injuries from it. And typically those are either shoulder or lower back injuries. And when it comes to the lower back injuries, that's usually a case of either bad form, you're just putting too much stress into your lower back, and we'll get into that in a bit. So bad form can definitely contribute to kettlebells beating you up. The other part of it, I think, is improper programming and kind of workout structure. So as far as programming goes, you definitely need to ease into it. If you haven't been doing dynamic ballistic movements like kettlebell swings, there's going to be an adjustment period for your tissue, your muscles and your connective tissue to adjust to the new stimulus. So it's really important when you're first starting this to just start lighter than you think and kind of ramp up over time. Over the course of a couple weeks, always just progressing a little bit slower than you think until after a few months, then you can start going a little bit harder at it. The other part is exercise order. Sometimes people they'll do deadlifts and then they'll do bent over row and then they'll do kettlebell swing and they say, oh, my back hurts from the kettlebell swing. Well, it's just maybe that workout was so lower back intensive that by the time you got to it, you were just too fatigued. So I think you have to treat the kettlebell swing, kettlebell snatches when you're doing them in your program. You have to treat them as big, heavy movements and plan your workout accordingly. And then specifically to the shoulder injuries, typically that's coming about when people don't have enough overhead mobility to put the kettlebell in a good position as they go overhead. And we'll get into that as we get into some of the overhead movements today. So as far as a getting started guide, what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to give you 4 basic kettlebell movements that I think are a great introduction to the kettlebell, not just as an instrument, but also as a modality of training. I mentioned tension, relaxation being part of it. I mentioned human movement being part of it. And you'll see some of these things as we get into the exercises. But what I'm presenting here today is kind of 4 basic movements to introduce you to kettlebells. And for each of these movements, I'm going to teach you how to do it properly. I'll go over some of the common pitfalls that people run into regarding the form for these exercises. And then I'll give some kind of general program guideline. If you want to print out a guide or if you want something in writing, I also have a companion PDF for this video. It includes the programming guidelines as well as a workout and program in the PDF. So if you're interested in that, it's going to be in the link in the description below this video. All right, the first exercise we're going to talk about here is the kettlebell swing. The kettlebell swing is, I think, the king of the kettlebell exercises. It's the one that I definitely spent the most time on in my own training. It's something that's been a staple week in, week out for 10, 15 years, more than that now. It promotes tremendous hip power, power endurance, and it's also great for body composition. It kind of bridges the gap between strength and cardio. You will feel out of breath, you will feel winded. It is a fantastic exercise. I'm excited to share with you. So, let me show you a few reps of a kettlebell swing, and then we'll. So there's a big power component, and that power component comes with some looseness that I'm powering the kettlebell, and then I'm kind of loose and fluid here. I let the kettlebell float, and then now as I come down, I'm back into a very powerful, tension motion again. So what the kettlebell swing is based on is the pattern of a hip hinge. And a hip hinge means that our hips go backwards, and we kind of, just like a door hinge, we're going to bend from the hips here. So one way that you can visualize that, a lot of people have seen this before, is to just put a dowel across your back, and the dowel goes, it tips forward, okay? What I'm not doing is rounding my spine, and that's why the dowel's there. What I'm also not doing in a hip hinge is squatting. So in a squat, my hips start coming down. In a hinge, I'm more focused on them going backwards, okay? And that's going to load the glutes and the hamstrings more. It's also going to take some stress out of your lower back and make this a really strong glute exercise that's very mechanically powerful. So the way that we're going to learn to do it is, we mentioned the hip hinge here. Just, this might take you only 2 or 3 reps just to verify that you have a hip hinge. What we're going to do is we're going to stand over a kettlebell, and the kettlebell is between my heels. I'm going to take my karate choppers, and I'm going to kind of put them in the crease of my hips here and push my hips back. From here, I'm going to reach down to the kettlebell, and again, I'm in that good hip hinge position, and I'm going to stand up strong with it, okay? If you can't do this, without rounding your back, you feel uncoordinated in it, you can definitely spend a few weeks doing this as an exercise and making sure that you have that pattern. Okay. Most people won't need to do that. Most people will bend down and be able to do a hip hinge, but it's important that we have the pattern in place as we get into the exercise. The next thing that we're going to do to learn how to swing the kettlebell, so now we're into kind of a progression. This is not an exercise that you're going to do in the long term. It's something you're going to do a couple of times to learn how to swing the kettlebell, and then you'll never need to do it again. But what this next one is called is pendulum. So what we're going to do in the pendulum is, we're again going to hip hinge, come down to the kettlebell, and we're going to pick it up maybe, 8 to 12 inches off the floor. And from here, we're just going to kind of get the kettlebell moving. And you can see that at the back, I push it in, I push my wrists into my groin here. And there's really a lot of connection between my arms and my torso in the backswing. As it goes forward, I'm just sort of letting it swing. So I push backwards, I let it swing forward. Push, swing, okay? And this is just a way to teach your arms to be loose and kind of reinforce the position of the hip hinge. Once we have that feeling of being able to kind of balance the moving kettlebell, the next thing we're going to do is, we're going to do a pendulum where we stand up aggressively on every 4th rep. So we're going to do 3 pendulums, and then the 4th one's going to look like a kettlebell swing. 1, 2, 3, and 4. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now I can do it on every 3rd. 2 and 3. 1, 2, and 3. And now I'll do it every other. 1 and 2. 1 and 2. As I'm comfortable with that, I can just start swinging the kettlebell. When I put it down, let me show you a good put down. I put it boop, boop. And that avoids me doing anything weird with my back, or being pulled off balance, whatnot, by the kettlebell. Okay. So now we've done a kettlebell swing. We did a few at the end of that pendulum there. Now we need to learn how to get into the kettlebell swing properly when we're doing it as part of our workout. And very simply, we're going to now take about an arm's length step back from the kettlebell. We're going to hinge at the hips again. And we're just going to tilt the kettlebell on its side here. To get started, I'm going to like hike it behind me, just like I did on the pendulum. And I'm going to get right into my swings. Boop, boop to put it down. Okay. You'll hear that I use the kind of hard style breath. I go at the top. That helps me brace my core. It helps me integrate the power of my core and my hips with my breath, which I think is a very important martial arts concept, that's been studied for thousands of years. The kettlebell has a very sharp pop at the top, and then there's a lot of looseness on the backswing as you see the kettlebell floats. There's a differential in speed. It's not like a metronome. It's I like to think of it as like drawing back the bow on a bow and arrow, and then it shoots forward. Let's get into common troubleshooting. So I'm going to show you, I'm going to just mention one. The one that I'll mention is that if we see the back rounding as you go back, I don't even want to do it with a weight. Not that rounding your back under load is necessarily dangerous, but to be swinging a weight with your back rounding, I don't think is ideal at all. And, if you're not ready for it, that's definitely something that can cause, tightness in your lower back. So the first thing we want to avoid and just keep an eye out for is that as we move to this more dynamic movement, that we don't start seeing the lower back start moving. That's the first troubleshooting to watch out for. The second one, I'll show you 2 drills, is people not being strong enough at the top. So they'll do a kettlebell swing that looks something like this. When we see that, what we want to do is we want to stand tall here on the ground, tighten our abs, tighten our quads, tighten our glutes, and have this feeling of rooting into the floor. And now we want to take this back to the top of the kettlebell swing. Right there. So I have that strong hip pop. The other thing we see is hands kind of being disconnected from the hips. So that might look something like this. You can see the timing's off. Something just looks wrong about it. The timing's off. The arms are disconnected from the body. One of the ways that we can troubleshoot this is a towel swing. You can use a length of towel or a piece of rope. I think this came off a TRX. And basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the kettlebell now 90 degrees. I'm going to loop my rope through it. And I'm just going to hold a few inches from the handle. And now I'm going to get into my swing. And I'm trying to keep tension on the rope the whole time. So if things start getting weird with the arms, the rope's going to make it really apparent.
Okay, for the kettlebell swings, the way that we're going to program this is we're going to use an every minute on the minute time control. So what that means is you'll start a timer running. When it hits minute number 1, you're going to do 8 reps on that minute. 8 reps will probably take you about 15 seconds, so you'll have the remainder of the minute, roughly 45 seconds to recover. As the timer hits minute number 2, you'll do the same thing, and so on and so forth for 8 total minutes in the first week, 8 to 12. And, you can do this every 3 to 10 days. And the way that we're going to progress this is by basically building density. So we're either going to add time or reps or both in any one week. So we start in week 1, we're able to do 32 kilo for 8 reps on the minute for 8 minutes. In week 2, we do the same weight in reps, but we're able to extend it for 10 minutes. In week 3, we're up to 10 reps for 10 minutes, and so on and so forth. After week 4, we're able to do 32 kilo, 10 reps, 12 minutes, 120 reps total for the workout. And at that point, we feel comfortable to move forward to a 40 kilo kettlebell with the reps and the minutes coming down now as we moved up a bell. And it's kind of up to you and your training goals to decide what kind of rep range and how many minutes. If you're looking more for power, you should bias lower rep ranges. If you're looking more for endurance, you should be biasing higher rep ranges and longer duration.
Next, we have overhead press. So overhead pressing kettlebells is a great way to build upper body strength. And as I kind of mentioned a little bit in the intro, the implement of a kettlebell is a very convenient and a very useful implement for overhead pressing. As opposed to a dumbbell, which it kind of just wobbles a lot because of how the weight's placed at the end, the kettlebell provides a very predictable feedback for pressing. And it allows you to use a lot of weight in a way that I think builds a really strong and stable shoulder. Um, it lets you get all the way to straight overhead, which sometimes with a dumbbell feels weird as you balance it. It's almost like the weight of the kettlebell behind the hand kind of pulls the arm into a good overhead position. So, what do I mean by good overhead position? What I mean by good overhead position um, is that there's not a lot of bend in the lower back. I'm not having to bend at the lower back. I'm able to get my arm just on its own flexibility directly overhead. My elbow should be straight. And so this lack of ability to get to a good overhead position, that's what's going to drive the majority of shoulder problems that people experience from kettlebells. And so if you can't get to a good overhead position, uh, don't do overhead press. And we'll talk about this a little bit more on Turkish Get-Up, but you need to take some kind of remedial action because you should be able to put your arm overhead. You know, pec tightness can contribute to it, and in general, jujitsu mobility posture can inhibit good overhead motion, and that's why I believe good overhead movement as part of your strength and conditioning routine is a really great thing for bulletproofing your shoulders. And I really recommend that grapplers be able to go overhead and then get strong at going overhead. So let's look at how to do that. We can press kettlebells from a variety of positions. We can do it from half kneeling. We can do it from standing. We'll look at it standing today. We can do it with two kettlebells in one in each hand. Today, we're just going to look at a single kettlebell pressed overhead. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the kettlebell into a good start position. And we'll go over the clean in future videos. We're going to do an advanced kettlebell video in a few weeks. But right now, I'm just going to start with my forearm vertical. Notice that my wrist is neutral. One of the most common errors I'll see is people holding a kettlebell like this. It's not as strong. It can be tough on your wrists if you do it a lot. So again, I want to pick it up and get to a good, nice neutral wrist position. From here, I'm going to tighten up my core. I'm going to tighten up my glutes. I can make a fist with my opposite hand. And I'm going to drive the kettlebell straight overhead into my good overhead position. As such. That's your overhead press. Let's take a look at some programming.
So for overhead press, the old saying is to press a lot, you must press a lot, meaning to press a lot of weight. You need to press a lot of volume over a lot of weeks. And what we're going to do is we're going to start with 3 to 4 sets of about 4 to 6 reps. Again, maybe a little bit less volume than we'd see for someone who is not doing jiu-jitsu several times a week. And depending on what kettlebells you have available to you, you're going to have to do more and more reps with a bigger jump. So for example, if I have a 24 kilo and a 32 kilo and I don't have anything in between, I'm going to need to build up to, 3 to 4 sets of maybe 10 to 15 reps before I move up to the heavier bell. I just have to accumulate that volume over many weeks. If I have a 24 and then a 28, maybe I'm ready to move up after 3 sets of 8. But the goal is just to continually add reps and sets if necessary until you've built up the strength to move up to a heavier kettlebell.
Right, next we have a variation of the goblet squat called the prying goblet squat. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my elbows to kind of pry my hips open like you'd use a crowbar to pry. This is a great exercise to enforce good hip, ankle, and even, spine mobility, especially in the upper spine. And it also is a great illustration of the concept of loaded stretching. So we talked about this a little bit in our pec tightness video. It's good and useful to stretch, and I recommend stretching. But what you'll get in even greater and additional stimulus for your mobility and flexibility is that when you're able to bear load at end range positions. So what we're going to do for the prying goblet squat is we're going to take the kettlebell, we're going to pick it up, and we're going to kind of hold it by its horns here. And what we're going to do is we're going to squat down, connecting our elbows to the top of our knees. And now from here, I'm just going to kind of rock from side to side. I'm keeping a nice upright chest here, and I'm pushing my elbows into my hips here to open up my hips. When I'm ready, I'm going to stand up and go back down. This exercise has been fantastic to me over the years. I have trouble squatting. I actually walked on my toes as a kid until I was 8 years old. Had an Achilles tendon surgery on both ankles. So squatting for me can be tough because of ankle restrictions. And this has been a great one to help me restore that mobility that I didn't always have. Let me show it from the side so I can talk about some of the spine position. So right here, I'm going to squat down. And I'm going to be trying to keep my back in a nice neutral and strong position here. I don't want to start letting myself round out here. I'm going to just try to stay strong. It's not that it's dangerous to do this necessarily. It's just that it takes the stimulus off my hips and my ankles where I want it. And then it kind of just turns into a rounding posture. We already do so much rounding in jiu-jitsu that I'm just trying to open up my hips and stay in a nice tall posture.
For the Prying Goblet squat, we don't have a whole lot of programming guidelines here. This is really a mobility exercise. It's a great warm-up before you squat with a heavier weight, for example, Zercher squats or front squats. You can do this as often as you wish. So if you have hip mobility as a goal or ankle mobility as a goal, this is something you can be doing every single day and potentially even multiple times per day.
All right, so the next thing we're going to talk about here is Turkish get-ups. And Turkish get-ups, I think, are really controversial. There's the kettlebell, like, enthusiast camp that say the Turkish get-up is, like, the greatest exercise there is, that it's such a, grand total body workout, that it's the only exercise you even need is just swings and get-ups. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you have people that, typically come from a more bodybuilding approach, and they say, well, this exercise is so general that it doesn't provide a stimulus to any single muscle. And I think they're kind of both right. I think the way that we can look at the Turkish get-up is that we should look at it as kind of like a movement puzzle for grapplers. And learning to solve this puzzle will teach you to move from the right segments of your body, teach you to move from the hips, and reduce motion at the spine. Again, not that spine motion is necessarily injurious, but it's just more powerful for us to use our hips in grappling than to try to move someone with spine motion. So we want to bring the big muscles into our movement patterns as much as possible so that we can develop strength. So the Turkish get-up, it teaches you that, because if you're not able to figure out the movement puzzle, it means that either you're lacking stability somewhere, that you're not able to stabilize in that position, that you're lacking the mobility to even get in that position, or that you're just lacking a certain sense of coordination to be able to use your big muscles and coordinate what's moving and what's not moving, as we're going to see as we get into the movement. So I think once you learn to solve the movement puzzle of the Turkish get-up, I don't think it's something you need to do every single week for the rest of your life. And when I say solve the movement puzzle, what does that mean? I think it means that if you're, a decently strong dude, you should be able to use somewhere between a third and a half of your body weight for a Turkish get-up. For a female, maybe, a quarter to a third of your body weight. So if you weigh 200 pounds, you should be able to do a Turkish get-up with a 40-kilo kettlebell. And until you can, I think you'll reap benefit from learning to do this motion. But once you can, well, then, yeah, it becomes true that, like, you're not providing a tremendous stimulus to any one muscle group. And it's so general that, yeah, maybe it's not something we have to spend time on week in and week out. Now, that said, a lot of people like to use the Turkish get-up as part of like a hyper minimalist approach where, Simple and Sinister, for example, is a very famous Pavel program that involves just swings and get-ups for, months, potentially years on end if you talk to some of these people. And what they're getting out of that is, again, it's just super minimalist. It's 2 exercises, very short workouts, works well when you have something else going on, whether that something else is grappling, military deployment, or just, being busy, being a dad and working full time. But the get up in that role provides a lot of time under tension. And because it does touch so many so many muscle groups, it becomes a total body workout. Is it the most optimal way to get each muscle stimulated? Not necessarily, but what it is a way to develop musculature in a way that's balanced throughout your body, um, and develop movement quality. The final thing I'll say about get-ups as far as where do they fit in is that they can provide a kind of like canary in the coal mine effect, where if you're having a problem, it's going to show up in your get-up probably before it shows up in other places, potentially and hopefully even before pain shows up. So what do I mean by that? Well, we've talked about pec tightness on this channel before. If I start going to do a get-up and I'm going to do this low sweep here, and I find I'm just so tight in the chest that I can't even get into this position. Well, hey, now I know that I have to go back to this other video and get my pecs tightness addressed. Shoulder issues, shoulder stability. These are things that are going to show up in your get up and give you a chance to address them before they start causing you a bigger problem. So let's get into how to do a Turkish get-up. I think in a lot of ways you can look at the get-up as kind of like 6 or 7 exercises built into one. And let me talk about each of those. I'll talk you through it here. So we're going to start with the kettlebell on our side here in kind of this fetal position. And we're going to take a nice, just like we did on the press, we're going to take a nice neutral wrist position. And we're going to roll the kettlebell into our start position. Okay. So from our start position, my elbow's straight here, and I'm on about a 45-degree angle here with my arm and my leg. What I'm going to do is I'm going to drive through this heel on the same side of the kettlebell. I'm going to pull with this elbow on the opposite side, and that's going to roll me onto my elbow here. I shouldn't see my leg move too much, my left leg in this case. I should be able to keep it down and drive through the hips and the core. From here, I'm going to post my left hand on the mat and come up to this tall seated position. Next, I'm going to bring my hips up and I'm going to bring my knee back such that my toe, my hand, and my knee form a line. If I need to adjust my foot position to feel more comfortable, I can here. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to transfer my weight from my left hand into my left hip and come up into this position here. Here we work on a good overhead position. And now I'm going to step forward so that my legs are on train tracks, and I'm going to stand up in a lunge. From this lunge, again, I'm in a good overhead position. I'm going to take a big reverse lunge step, and now all the movements are going to happen in reverse. So I go to my reverse lunge. I'm going to open at 90 degrees and look up at the kettlebell. From here on through, I'm looking at the kettlebell the whole way. I come back to that position again where my toe, my knee, and my hand are in a line. Now with my weight in my left hand and my right heel, I'm going to sit down to here, to my tall seated position. I bring my elbow back down, and I'm going to control the kettlebell all the way back to the start position. How important is it to be perfect on form with this? It is important. I think that, being like a real stickler on form, especially in kettlebells, sometimes it can get in the way of, progress as far as moving up in weight. When it comes to your Turkish get-up, the better your form is and the closer you can make it look to, what I've described here, the easier time you're going to have moving a heavier weight. So that gets at, again, the kind of the concept of the movement puzzle for grapplers is that by learning to use good form, we're learning to use the most efficient technique that'll allow us to move the most weight. I mentioned earlier the idea of using the get up as a mobility tool if you can't get to a good overhead position. And all I meant by that is that you can use partial get ups. So I can do a get up, maybe just the first 2 steps. And then as I get to here, it's hard for me to keep my elbows straight for the rest of the movement. So I'm just going to finish it right here and go back down. Over time, the hope would be that as I develop strength, I'm able to get further and further into the get up and develop mobility and shoulder stability along the way.
Turkish Get-Up programming, a lot of confusion about this. It's very hard to progress in the same way because you can't do sets and reps. You wouldn't do a set of 8 Turkish Get-Ups because each rep takes so long. So I think you have to look at it as a skill acquisition task and look at it as kind of practicing, almost like you'd practice a kata in karate. A good workout will be 3 to 8 get-ups per side, and one of the things from a motor learning perspective that's important is to vary the weight. So they used to call it wave loading, And by working with different weights, we're able to kind of help our brain learn this task better. At the heavier weight, we'll get a stimulus to kind of feel what the heavier weight's like. We'll expose the deficiencies in our technique, and then we can work at lighter weights to address those deficiencies. Every few weeks, I think it's good to work up to a heavy single. I put 1 RM in quotes here. It might not be the heaviest one you've ever done, but just working up and seeing where you're at that week. A great 3 week microcycle I've used a lot with clients and with myself in the past. Do a bunch of singles on the first week, kind of get acclimated to the movement, catch some volume. And on the second week, we'll do what we call a light, medium, heavy ladder. So we'll take a light kettlebell, a medium kettlebell, and then a heavier kettlebell. And you'll do them in that order, 2 to 3 rounds. And then in week 3, we work up to a PR in this case, or just a heavy single. Obviously, if you don't have a variety of kettlebells available to you, then you just need to practice with one kettlebell, and that works fine.
All right, so we went over 4 different exercises. We looked at the kettlebell swing, we looked at overhead pressing, we looked at the Turkish Get-Up, and we looked at a variation of the goblet squat called the Prying goblet squat. I think these are a great way to get started with kettlebells. If you're looking for more help on organizing these into workouts and program, check out the companion PDF in the link in description below the video. And if you're looking for more training, you're looking to take your training to the next level, I offer coaching in kind of a couple different ways. If you're local to South Florida, I'm in West Boca near Deerfield Beach. I train grapplers out of my professional grade facility here. If you're not local, I offer online coaching, programming, and you can find me at jason.kapnick@gmail.com. Put coaching in the subject line.